4:14 a.m., December 22, 1944, Foy, Belgium. The Ardennes forest was a landscape of jagged black glass and suffocating white fog. Inside the reinforced cellar of a converted flour mill, Major Friedrich Vogt of the 2nd Panzer Division felt a rare sense of warmth. He sat behind a heavy oak table, reviewing maps by the glow of a kerosene lamp while sipping a glass of 1937 Bordeaux. To Vogt, a veteran of the Eastern Front, this cellar was a cathedral of safety. 2 feet of solid limestone stood between him and the American Amis. He felt superior, insulated by the weight of German engineering and the reconnaissance reports that claimed the Americans were out of heavy ordnance. In the next 45 seconds, Friedrich Vogt would cease to exist. 300 yards away, tucked into a frozen drainage pipe slick with frozen mud and human waste, Private Silas Thorne stared through the iron sights of his M1 Garand. His hands were blue, his boots were sodden, and his lungs burned with every shallow breath. He wasn't holding a bazooka or a satchel charge. He was clutching 2 stolen sacks of industrial-grade baking flour. What Silas Thorne was about to do would flip doctrine on its head. It was a maneuver explicitly forbidden by his commanding officers, a suicide stunt that threatened a court-martial. But Silas knew something the generals didn't. He knew the anatomy of an explosion. Silas Thorne wasn't a product of the Virginia Military Institute or a tactical mastermind. He was a dust hog from the high plains silos of Salina, Kansas. Before the draft board called his name, Silas's world was defined by the golden haze of wheat. In the Great Depression, he spent 12 hours a day moving millions of pounds of grain. In those silos, Silas learned a terrifying truth. A grain elevator isn't just a building, it's a bomb waiting for a reason to go off. He had seen a single static spark from a conveyor belt turn a concrete skyscraper into a pillar of fire because of dust suspension. He learned to think in angles, calculating how particulates moved through air shafts and how the right concentration of organic matter could become more volatile than TNT. When he enlisted, his instructors at Fort Riley were baffled. While other recruits practiced standard flanking maneuvers, Silas was asking about the ventilation cycles of bunkers. He saw the world not in terms of cover and concealment, but in terms of airflow and confinement pressure. His sergeants marked him as unorthodox and difficult, dismissing his civilian logic as the ramblings of a farm boy who didn't understand the professional way to fight a war. By the time the 101st reached Foy, the professional way was failing. The mill was a tactical nightmare, a hard point that overlooked the only supply route. It was untouchable by standard army mortars. The cost of following the field manual was written in the snow. First was Corporal Elias Thorne, no relation to Silas, a 21-year-old from Scranton who could play the fiddle like a pro. He had a letter in his pocket from a girl named Martha, promising to marry him on New Year's Day. He was stitched apart by a German MG-42 while trying to throw a standard-issue grenade at the mill's door. Then came PFC Miller, just 18, a farm boy from Iowa who carried a wood-carved bird he'd made for his younger brother. He was vaporized by a German mortar before he even cleared the tree line. Captain Sterling, a man with a polished West Point ring and a uniform that stayed suspiciously clean, refused to listen to Silas's insane suggestion. "We wait for the 75mm guns," Sterling barked. "Anything else is a violation of protocol. I won't have my men using kitchen supplies to fight panzers." To Sterling, the manual was a Bible. To the men in the mud, it was a death warrant. Silas Thorne didn't look at the mill as a fortress. He looked at it as a silo. Through his binoculars, he spotted a tiny flaw the West Point strategists had missed. The mill's original grain loading chutes were still active. The Germans had converted them into a centralized ventilation system to keep the basement air breathable while they ran their coal heaters and radio generators. Silas noticed the intake fan was pulling air inward at a massive rate. He presented his plan one last time. Use the intake to flood the basement with a high-density cloud of flour, then ignite it. Captain Sterling's reaction was immediate. "You do this, Thorne, and I'll see you in front of a court-martial for wasting rations and unauthorized field modifications." Silas didn't argue. He waited for the moon to dip behind a cloud. He went rogue. Under the shroud of a sudden snow squall, he slipped away from his unit. He stole the flour from the mess truck. He moved alone, dragging his gear through the no man's land between the lines, knowing that if he failed, he'd die a disgraced thief. If he succeeded, he might just save what was left of his platoon. The smell of fermented corn and wet stone clung to the mill's exterior. Silas could hear the muffled voices of German soldiers through the walls, the sound of men who thought they were safe. The mud sucked at his boots as he crawled the final 20 yards to the primary intake vent. He reached the vent. He measured the gap, 14 inches off the frozen ground. The wind was gusting at 8 miles per hour from the northwest, a perfect vacuum for the intake. Silas didn't just throw the flour. He carefully rigged the sacks over the intake, using a small, low-yield primer cap to burst the bags without igniting them. He needed the flour to be aspirated, sucked into the basement, and suspended in the air. He retreated exactly 120 yards into the drainage pipe, his heart hammered against his ribs. He checked the anatomy of the building one last time. The stone was 2 feet thick, but the roof was old timber. The pressure would have nowhere to go but up and out. He exhaled halfway, held, squeezed. The Springfield kicked. The tracer round streaked through the dark, a needle of neon red hitting the vent. Silence. Then the earth groaned. A dull, thudding whomp shook the forest floor. The mill didn't just explode, it exhaled a localized sun. A thermobaric wave of orange flame erupted from every window simultaneously as the suspended dust ignited in a chain reaction. The roof was lifted 10 feet into the air before disintegrating into splinters. Major Vogt's command post, the impenetrable fortress, became a pressure cooker that collapsed in on itself. The path to Foy was open. The German coordination in the sector had been decapitated in a single second. 14 high-ranking officers were neutralized, and the MG-42 nests, suddenly without orders, were quickly overrun. In the official reports, the destruction of the mill was attributed to fortuitous long-range artillery. The Army eventually studied the effects of fuel-air explosives and integrated the concept into official doctrine during the Cold War, but they never credited the private from Kansas. Silas Thorne was given a quiet reprimand for misappropriation of supplies and leaving his post without orders. When the war ended, Silas didn't stay for the victory parades. He went back to Salina. He went back to the elevators, the dust, and the silence. He never told his neighbors why he always flinched when someone dropped a bag of flour in the local grocery store. He never told his children about the night he turned a mill into a bomb. He simply put on his overalls and went back to work. He had cows to milk. He had grain to move. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.